Hello, my dear friend. This is a channel filled with tales straight from the future, and we have a large collection of stories for children in audio format. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories.
Tiny Tim's Cybernetic Adventure. Part 1. The Curious Case of Tiny Tim. In the gleaming cyber city of New Neon, where holographic billboards lit up the sky and hover cars zipped between towering skyscrapers, there lived a very unusual person named Tiny Tim. I remember him clearly from when I was just a kid, even though it feels like a lifetime ago in our fast-changing world. Tiny Tim wasn't like anyone else in New Neon. He was super short, barely taller than a cleaning bot, but his head was huge, way bigger than normal. It looked kind of like a glowing orb on top of a mini robot body. He lived all alone in an old, glitchy apartment building that stood out among the sleek, modern towers. We hardly ever saw Tiny Tim outside. Once a month, he'd come out to get supplies, his oversized head bobbing as he walked. Sometimes we'd spot him on his rooftop garden, his big head moving back and forth as he tended to his digital plants. Us kids, we were mean back then. Whenever Tiny Tim came out, we'd gather around and make fun of him. We even made up a nasty song about his big head and tiny body. I was the worst of all. Once I used my hoverboard to zoom by and knock him over. I thought it was hilarious at the time. But then something happened that changed everything. Tiny Tim went to talk to my dad after I knocked him down. I hid behind our smart door, feeling scared and guilty. When my dad found out what I'd done, he was super angry. He punished me by taking away my holo games for a whole week. I felt awful, but I had no idea that this was just the beginning of an amazing story, one that would change how I saw Tiny Tim forever. Part 2, A Journey Begins. My dad sat me down and told me Tiny Tim's story. It was way more interesting than I ever imagined. Tiny Tim was born in the old part of New Neon, where the neon lights were dim and flickering. His dad, a well-respected tech repairman, didn't have much money. People thought Tiny Tim looked weird because of his big head, so they mostly ignored him. Even his own family wasn't very nice to him. When Tiny Tim's dad died, things got really tough. His mean relatives kicked him out of the house. All they gave him were his dad's old clothes, a baggy jumpsuit and a pair of worn-out hover boots. Tiny Tim had to use his dad's old nano tailor to make the clothes fit his tiny body. With nowhere else to go, Tiny Tim decided to leave New Neon and find his own path. He set off on his hover boots, zooming past the city limits into the unknown world beyond. For days, Tiny Tim traveled through strange landscapes. He saw fields of glowing crops and forests of metal trees. He was tired, hungry, and lonely. Finally, he reached another big city called Cyber Central. As he wandered the busy streets of Cyber Central, feeling lost and hungry, something caught his attention. He smelled something delicious coming from an old-fashioned house. It stood out among the shiny buildings like a relic from the past. An old woman's voice came from inside, calling out, "Dinner time, come and get it." Tiny Tim thought she was inviting people for dinner. He was so hungry that he didn't think twice. He walked right into the house, hoping for a warm meal and maybe a kind word. Little did he know, this decision would lead to a wild adventure he never expected. Part 3, The Cyber Witch's Lair. When Tiny Tim walked into the old house, he got a big surprise. The old woman wasn't calling people for dinner at all. She was calling her robo-pets. The place was full of cyber cats and techno dogs, all beeping and whirring as they came for their battery charge. The old woman, who looked like a cyber witch with her glowing eyes and silver hair, was shocked to see Tiny Tim. At first, she yelled at him for barging in. But when she saw how hungry and tired he was, she felt sorry for him. She gave him some energy cubes to eat and let him rest on a hollow couch. Then the cyber witch had an idea. She told Tiny Tim he could stay if he helped take care of her robo-pets. Tiny Tim agreed, happy to have a place to stay. At first, the job was easy. Tiny Tim would charge the pets, update their software, and clean their shiny coats. But soon, things got tricky. The cyber cats started causing trouble when the witch was away. They'd knock over hollow vases and scratch the quantum furniture. Even though it wasn't his fault, the witch always blamed Tiny Tim. No matter how hard he tried to explain, the witch believed her precious cyber cats over him. She'd scold Tiny Tim and threaten to turn him into a robo-rat. What's worse, she never gave him the digicoins she promised for his work. Feeling sad and frustrated, Tiny Tim decided it was time to leave. But before he could go, he accidentally found a hidden room in the house. It was full of old, non-digital stuff. Among the strange objects, two things caught his eye: a pair of ordinary-looking slippers and an old wooden walking stick. Something told Tiny Tim these weren't ordinary items. Without really knowing why, he grabbed them and snuck out of the cyber witch's house. Little did he know, these simple objects would change his life in ways he could never imagine. Part 4: The Supersonic Slippers. Tiny Tim snuck out of the cyber witch's house, clutching the old slippers and walking stick. Once he was a safe distance away, he decided to try on the slippers. They looked so ordinary, but as soon as he put them on, something amazing happened. Whoosh! Tiny Tim shot forward like a rocket. He zoomed past hovercars and even outpaced the bullet trains. It was exciting, but also super scary because he couldn't stop or turn. He kept yelling, "Stop, slow down," but nothing worked. After a wild ride through the city, Tiny Tim finally figured out how to control the slippers. He had to say, "Pause, slippers," to stop, and "Go, slippers," to start. It took some practice, but soon he was zipping around like a pro. Using his new superspeed, Tiny Tim traveled to a city called Technotopia. This place was run by a powerful tech mogul everyone called the Cyber King. Tiny Tim had an idea. He could use his incredible speed to get a job as the Cyber King's messenger. When Tiny Tim arrived at the Cyber King's massive skyscraper, he found out they were having tryouts for a new messenger. The current fastest messenger, a guy in a shiny silver suit, was bragging about how unbeatable he was. Tiny Tim stepped up and said, "I'd like to race." Everyone laughed at first, but the Cyber King said, "Let's see what you can do, little guy." They set up a race across the city. When the signal came, Tiny Tim whispered, "Go, slippers," and took off like lightning. He was just a blur, zooming past buildings and bridges. He finished the race before the other guy had even reached the halfway point. The Cyber King and all his techie advisors were amazed. They'd never seen anyone move so fast. Right then and there, the Cyber King hired Tiny Tim as his new top messenger. Tiny Tim couldn't believe it. He'd gone from having nothing to working for the most powerful person in Technotopia. Things were finally looking up, but little did he know, his adventures were just beginning. Part 5: Treasure and Trouble. Tiny Tim loved his new job as the Cyber King's top messenger. He zoomed around Technotopia, delivering important messages and packages faster than anyone had ever seen. The Cyber King was super impressed and started to trust Tiny Tim with more and more important tasks. But not everyone was happy about Tiny Tim's success. The other workers at the skyscraper, especially the guy who used to be the fastest messenger, were jealous. They didn't like that this newcomer with a big head and tiny body was suddenly the Cyber King's favorite. No matter how nice Tiny Tim tried to be, the other workers ignored him or said mean things behind his back. He felt lonely and sad, even though he was doing so well at his job. One day, Tiny Tim remembered the old walking stick he'd taken from the Cyber Witch's house. He wondered if it might have special powers too, like the slippers. While walking in the Cyber King's high-tech garden, he tapped the stick on the ground 3 times. Suddenly, a holographic map appeared, showing a spot in the garden where something was buried. Tiny Tim dug there and found a chest full of old-fashioned gold coins. He later learned these coins were hidden by the Cyber King's father years ago. Excited about his discovery, Tiny Tim started using the walking stick to find more treasure in the garden. He thought if he shared some of the gold with the other workers, they might finally like him. But his plan didn't work out as he hoped. The other workers saw Tiny Tim digging in the garden and whispering to his walking stick. They also noticed he suddenly had a lot of gold coins to spend. The jealous workers started spreading rumors. They told the Cyber King's chief of security that Tiny Tim must be stealing from the Royal Crypto Vault. They said there was no other way he could have so much money. Poor Tiny Tim had no idea he was in big trouble. He thought he was finally going to make friends, but instead, he was about to face the biggest challenge of his life. Part 6: The King's Greed. The Cyber King heard the rumors about Tiny Tim stealing from the Royal Crypto Vault. Even though Tiny Tim had always been loyal, the king listened to the jealous workers. He ordered his robo-guards to arrest Tiny Tim and throw him in the digital dungeon. Poor Tiny Tim sat in his glowing cell, feeling scared and alone. He heard that the Cyber King was so angry, he was thinking about deleting Tiny Tim's code, which in Technotopia was like a death sentence. Realizing he had no other choice, Tiny Tim asked to speak to the Cyber King. When the king arrived, Tiny Tim spilled the beans about his magical slippers and walking stick. The Cyber King didn't believe him at first. "Prove it," he said, his eyes narrowing behind his tech-enhanced glasses. Tiny Tim took out his walking stick and tapped it 3 times in the garden. Just like before, a holographic map appeared, showing where more treasure was buried. The Cyber King was amazed when they dug up another chest of gold coins. Seeing that Tiny Tim was telling the truth, the Cyber King forgave him. But then his eyes got all greedy. He wanted to know all about the magical items. Tiny Tim told him about the slippers and how they could make you run super fast. But he was smart. He didn't tell the king how to control them. The Cyber King couldn't wait to try the slippers. He put them on his feet, and suddenly, zoom! He was off like a rocket, running around the garden so fast he was just a blur. But he couldn't stop. "Help! How do I stop these things?" the Cyber King yelled as he zoomed past again and again. Tiny Tim watched, not sure what to do. He had told the truth and was safe now, but the Cyber King's greed had gotten him into trouble. Tiny Tim wondered if he should help or if this was a lesson the king needed to learn on his own. Part 7. The Glitchberries. After running around for hours, the Cyber King finally figured out how to stop the slippers. He was red-faced and out of breath, and boy was he mad. He thought Tiny Tim had tricked him on purpose. "You've made a fool of me," the Cyber King shouted. "I banish you from Technotopia forever." The king's robo-guards took away Tiny Tim's magical slippers and walking stick. Then they escorted him to the city limits and kicked him out. Poor Tiny Tim was alone again, with nothing but the clothes on his back. Sad and tired, Tiny Tim wandered away from the shiny buildings of Technotopia. He walked for days until he reached a strange place called the Glitch Forest. It was full of trees that looked half real and half digital, with pixels floating off their leaves. Exhausted, Tiny Tim fell asleep under one of these weird trees. When he woke up, he was super hungry. He noticed some glowing berries on a nearby bush and decided to eat them. Big mistake. As soon as he swallowed the berries, Tiny Tim felt a strange tingling. He looked at his reflection in a puddle and gasped. He had grown long, fuzzy donkey ears, and his nose had stretched out like Pinocchio's. "Oh no," Tiny Tim cried, "what's happening to me?" In a panic, he ran around the forest, looking for help. By accident, he bumped into another bush, and some different berries fell into his mouth. Amazingly, as soon as he swallowed these new berries, his donkey ears shrank away and his nose went back to normal. Tiny Tim couldn't believe what had just happened. He looked at the 2 berry bushes, his mind racing with ideas. These magical berries could change how people looked and change them back again. "This is incredible," Tiny Tim said to himself. "Maybe I can use these berries to get back into Technotopia and teach the Cyber King a lesson about being greedy." Carefully, Tiny Tim gathered berries from both bushes, making sure to keep them separate. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet, but he knew these berries were going to be the key to his biggest adventure yet. Part 8. The Berry Trick. Tiny Tim came up with a clever plan to use the magical berries. He used some leftover pixels from the Glitch Forest to create a disguise. He made himself look like a tall, important scientist from a far-off tech city. Sneaking back into Technotopia, Tiny Tim, now calling himself Dr. Pixel, went straight to the Cyber King's skyscraper. He told the royal chef he had some super special berries that would make any food taste amazing. The chef was excited and bought all the berries, planning to use them in that night's royal feast. Tiny Tim chuckled to himself as he left, knowing what was about to happen. That evening, the Cyber King and all his important advisors ate the delicious meal, praising the chef for the wonderful new flavor. But as soon as they finished eating, something weird started happening. One by one, they all grew long, fuzzy donkey ears, and their noses stretched out like antennas. The Cyber King looked in a mirror and screamed. The whole skyscraper was in chaos. The next day, Tiny Tim returned to the skyscraper, still disguised as Dr. Pixel. He announced that he had heard about their problem and had a cure. "I am the famous Dr. Pixel," he said in a deep voice. "I can fix your unusual condition." To prove it, he gave some of the cure berries to the cyber prince. Everyone watched in amazement as the prince's donkey ears disappeared and his nose shrunk back to normal. The cyber king was desperate. "Please, Dr. Pixel, you must cure us all." "Of course, Your Majesty," Tiny Tim said. "But such a powerful cure comes at a price. I'll need something from your royal vault as payment." The Cyber King didn't even hesitate. He led Dr. Pixel to his secret vault, ready to give him anything he wanted. Little did he know, he was walking right into Tiny Tim's clever trap. Tiny Tim's triumph. As soon as they entered the royal vault, Tiny Tim's eyes lit up. There, sitting on a glowing pedestal, were his magical slippers and walking stick. The Cyber King had kept them as trophies. While pretending to look at all the shiny gadgets and piles of crypto coins, Tiny Tim inched closer to his magical items. The Cyber King, still sporting his donkey ears and long nose, was too busy offering different treasures to notice. Quick as a flash, Tiny Tim slipped on the magical slippers and grabbed the walking stick. Then he did something that shocked everyone. He pulled off his Dr. Pixel disguise. "Surprise!" Tiny Tim shouted. "It's me, Tiny Tim." The Cyber King's jaw dropped. "You, but how? Why?" Tiny Tim stood tall, well, as tall as he could, and said, "You were greedy and unfair. You didn't trust me and took away my magical items. Now you know how it feels to be judged by how you look." Before anyone could react, Tiny Tim shouted, "Go Slippers!" and zoomed out of the vault faster than a laser beam. He zipped through the skyscraper and out into the city, leaving behind a trail of confused and donkey-eared people. As he ran, Tiny Tim called out, "Don't worry, the effects will wear off in a few days. Maybe by then you'll have learned to be kinder and less greedy." Using his superspeed slippers, Tiny Tim raced all the way back to his old home in New Neon. He felt a mix of emotions, happy to have his magical items back, proud of his clever plan, and a little bit sorry for tricking everyone. But mostly he felt excited. He had his slippers and walking stick again, plus he knew the secret of the magical berries. Tiny Tim realized that his adventures were far from over. In fact, they were just beginning. As he looked out over the glowing city of New Neon, Tiny Tim wondered what amazing things he might do next with his magical items and his newfound confidence. Part 10, A New Perspective. As my dad finished telling me Tiny Tim's amazing story, I sat there with my mouth open, totally amazed. I couldn't believe that the person I'd made fun of had been through so many incredible adventures. "So you see," my dad said, "Tiny Tim isn't just some weird-looking guy. He's brave, clever, and has seen more of the world than most of us ever will." I felt really ashamed of how I'd treated Tiny Tim. "I had no idea," I said quietly. "I wish I hadn't been so mean to him." My dad nodded. "That's why we should never judge people by how they look. Everyone has a story, and often it's more interesting than we could ever guess." The next day, I told all my friends about Tiny Tim's adventures. They were just as surprised as I was. We all felt pretty bad about how we'd treated him. From that day on, everything changed. Whenever we saw Tiny Tim walking down the street or tending to his rooftop garden, instead of laughing, we'd wave and smile. Some of the braver kids would even ask him questions about his adventures. Tiny Tim seemed happier too. He started coming out more often, and he always had time to chat with us kids. He'd tell us stories about the glitch forest or the shiny streets of Technotopia. Sometimes, if we were lucky, he'd even show us a trick with his magical slippers or walking stick. People in New Neon stopped thinking of Tiny Tim as the weird guy with the big head. Now, he was the coolest, most interesting person in the whole city. Everyone wanted to hear his stories and learn from his experiences. As for me, I learned a really important lesson. I realized that kindness is way more important than fitting in or looking like everyone else. Tiny Tim taught me that real adventure, cleverness, and kindness can come in any size or shape. Now, whenever I see someone who looks different or unusual, I don't laugh or make fun. Instead, I wonder what amazing stories they might have to tell. After all, you never know. They might just be the hero of their own incredible adventure.
Until next time, my dear friend, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories.